to Exodus. To Exodus chapter 11. For those of you that have read through this passage recently, the end of chapter 10 and chapter 11 and over into chapter 12, it's again one of those passages that may be a little confusing to you. I don't know. We'll look at it here to see if you remember reading past this. Remember in the end of chapter 10, we've got Moses before Pharaoh again. And we've got the last of the 9 plagues or strokes here in the end of chapter 10. Then down in verse 27, but the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let them go. And Pharaoh said unto him, get thee out from me. Now he's speaking to Moses here. He said, get thee out from me. Take heed to thyself, see my face no more. For in that day thou seest my face, thou shalt die. And Moses said, thou hast spoken well, I will see thy face again no more. So it appears that he's expelling him out of his presence. But we see then it looks like Moses goes somewhere in chapter 11, verse 1, because it says, now the Lord said unto Moses, yet I will bring one more plague or one more stroke upon Pharaoh. But then, beginning with down in verse 4, and going through verse 8, we have Moses back in Pharaoh's presence again. See, he's talking to Pharaoh in 11, 4 through 8. Because down in verse 8, and all these thy servants shall come down unto me and bow down themselves unto me, saying, get thee out, and all the people that follow thee, and after that I will go out. And he went out from Pharaoh in a great anger. But Pharaoh said he'd kill him if he came in there again. And evidently he didn't get killed. Well, the way we rectify this alleged problem is to get out of our Western mind that thinks that chapter 10 happened first, chapter 11 happened second, and chapter 12 happened third. Now that's just the way we think. That's the way we're brought up. If it's over here on the left, it happened first. If it's over here on the right, it happened last. You know, we write left to right. Of course, you might not know this, the Hebrews write from right to the left, just the opposite of what we write. Not that that means a great deal, which way they write or which way we write, but to say that just because chapter 10 preceded chapter 11 and that both of these preceded 12 does not mean that they're in chronological order. So let me give you a little breakdown of the end of chapter 10, chapter 11, and chapter 12 to show you what's taking place when, so we'll clear up any problems. In chapter 10, verses 21 to 23, we have the plague of darkness. 10, 21 to 23, the plague of darkness. Then, secondly, in chapter 11, verses 1 to 3, and in chapter 12, verses 1 to 28. Chapter 11, 1 to 3, chapter 12, 1 to 28. This all takes place during the 3 days. Remember, this plague of darkness now takes the last 3 days. So all of what I just gave you, 11, 1 to 3, 12, 1 to 28, is taking place during the 3 days of this great plague of darkness. And of course, in these verses that I just gave you, God is giving Moses some commandments concerning the death of the firstborn that he's going to bring about and concerning the Passover. So you could put those first 3 verses of chapter 11 really go back with chapter 10, verses 21 to 23. Because in both of these places, God is speaking to Moses. And we know that he has spoken to Moses previous to him going before Pharaoh this last time, because Pharaoh said, don't come again, and he didn't. I'll show you. All this is a connected narrative here. Then thirdly, in chapter 10, verses 24 to 29. And then chapter 11, verses 4 to 8. We have Moses' interview, and this is his last interview before Pharaoh. So what that amounts to is when you get to the last verse of chapter 10. If you want to continue the narrative, just skip to the 4th verse of chapter 11. You following that? And you'd be in the same train of thought. All that's taking place at the same time. Whenever he tells Moses in the last verse of chapter 10, or whenever Moses said, "You've spoken, I'll see your face no more again," that didn't mean he walked out after that. He told him several more things. And finally, he leaves in verse 8. And he went out from Pharaoh in a great anger. So that's when he goes out. Those 3 verses are stuck in there just to show you what's going on at this time. Then fourthly, chapter 11, verses 9 to 10, Moses departs from Pharaoh. And then, to get in with the narrative, you have to skip all the way over to chapter 12, verses 29 and 30. And this is when we have the death of the firstborn. And then finally, chapter 12, verses 31 through 42. And this is when they actually begin to leave Egypt. A popular misconception concerning the Exodus and concerning the children of Israel leaving Egypt is that once the death of the firstborn had been effected upon the people by God, and of course Moses and Aaron had been called before Pharaoh again, which really is the last time they're ever before Pharaoh. This other time is the last time until the plague of the death of the firstborn. Then people think that after they've been called there and Pharaoh says to go, that they crossed the Red Sea, and that's not what took place. They went several places journeying before they got to the Red Sea, which is really a misnomer. It's not the Red Sea in the Bible anyway, which we'll explain when we get there. But they go through several places, which we see in chapter 12 and in chapter 13. Not until we get to chapter 14 we're going to see them actually crossing the sea. And chapter 14, along with chapter 12 and chapter 20, would be one of the 3 most important chapters in the book of Exodus. It's hard to pick out one of those 3 as being the most important, because in chapter 12 we have the institution of the Passover, which of course typifies the death of the Lord Jesus Christ. So that's a very important chapter. Chapter 14 is their monumental exodus from Egypt. And what's in chapter 20? 10 Commandments. That's a very important chapter too. So those would probably be what we could call the 3 most important chapters if we had to pick 3 out in the book of Exodus. All right, now what we're going to really be doing is starting with chapter 12 here this evening. Long chapter, what is that, 51 verses in our version. Contains several things, but the basic thing to remember about chapter 12 is the institution of the Passover. Now this became, remember now, they are slaves down in Egypt, so they've really got no calendar of their own, no regulations, no civil regulations or any form of government on their own. And this becomes their first month. Here in chapter 12, this becomes their first month, and we see the name of it in chapter 13 and verse 4. It's the month Abib, A-B-I-B, Abib, and it corresponds to our March, April. So this would be in the springtime, whenever they're going to be crossing over and out of the land of Egypt. Now, after the exile, you've got to remember this about Israel. They've got 2 calendars in the Old Testament, and they are continually going back and forth between the 2 calendars. They've got a religious calendar, and it starts with the month Abib, which is the first month. And then they have a civil calendar that ends up starting in the 7th month of their religious calendar, and that's their first month of their civil calendar. You follow all that? It's not important if you didn't follow that. We're just concerned right now about their religious calendar. And it was a 12-month period, and it was based upon their deliverance out of the land of Egypt. After the exile, I think that's over in Nehemiah, the name of this month is changed. The month of Abib is changed over in Nehemiah 2 and verse 1 to Nisan, which would be confusing unless you knew it was speaking of the same month. But after the exile, after the Babylonian captivity and exile, over in Nehemiah 2 and verse 1, then they changed the names of some of the months. And they changed particularly this first month, the month of Abib, and renamed it Nisan, chapter 2 and verse 1 of Nehemiah. It's difficult to go through as much material as we're trying to go through and see just what needs to be covered, because we just have to skip chapter after chapter after chapter of material here. So I really trust that you're staying up and you're reading so you know what's going on here, and we don't have to digress too far to explain. We can just try to give you a general outline and categorize some of these events that are taking place. Chapter 12, verse 37, we see them beginning to leave Egypt for the very first time here. The children of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth, about 600,000 on foot. That were men beside children. Now this would be men above the age of 20, 600,000 people, which would give us around 2.5 or 3 million composite. And a mixed multitude went up also with them. And this mixed multitude, of course, becomes a problem for them later on in their wanderings. And flocks and herds and even very much cattle. They baked unleavened cakes of the dough which they brought forth out of Egypt, for it was not leavened. Of course, the reason it was not leavened, back in verse 34, they're going to leave in such a hurry that the bread hadn't had time to leaven, and they just take it out just like it is and begin to leave. Because they were thrust out of Egypt and could not tarry, neither had they prepared for themselves any victuals. Now the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. And this is one of the two important texts to give you your Old Testament chronology, in addition to 1 Kings 6:1. And it came to pass at the end of 430 years, even the selfsame day, it came to pass that all the hosts of the Lord went out of the land of Egypt. It is a night to be much observed unto the Lord, for bringing them out from the land of Egypt. This is that night of the Lord to be observed of all the children of Israel in their generations. And of course, the reason that this is the most important night for them to observe is because of the faithfulness of God in passing over their houses. And that's just one of several reasons why they termed this particular feast the Passover. There were two other reasons, but this is the basic reason in Exodus chapter 12 that God faithfully passed over the blood that he saw shed and spilt and then marked upon their doorpost and the lintel of their house. So he passed over them. The angel of the Lord went through the midst of Egypt, of course slaying all the firstborn, from Pharaoh that sat upon his throne all the way to the beast in the land. He even slew the firstborn of the beast. God goes on to give some more information concerning the Passover in chapter 12. Chapter 13. Again, we have some additional information on the Passover, similar in some respects to chapter 12. But because they've made their initial move to leave Egypt, then God is rehearsing some things again to them. Verses 17 to 22 give us a little bit of their itinerary whenever they're first leaving Egypt. Now I'm going to show you a map here. I've got to change something on this map, so you don't want to copy it down just like it is, to show you exactly what's taking place in the Exodus, because you've got about as many views of their itinerary during the Exodus as you do commentaries that support the views, and it's rather difficult, even with the information that we have in Scripture, let alone to look into this archaeologically to find out exactly which direction they went, where they went. I mean, there are some general things about this that are right, and then there are some things that are not. So if you'll look in chapter 13 and verse 17, those of you that have a Bible the same as mine, your map in the back, I think, will be fairly similar to this one. The one difference there is, and there's really no justification for this, most of you probably got a map similar to the one I've got. Once they leave Ramesses, you see them go down south to Succoth, and then all of a sudden take off northeast. And you've really got no justification to see them heading up northeast. Let's see, you've got the same thing here. This map just doesn't have all the names that the one in your Bible might have. You see them leaving Ramesses here, and they're going down to Succoth, and all of a sudden they take off and come back up here. And of course, evidently, according to this map, this is where the Red Sea would be, because they've gone back up here, crossed over, then they started heading down this way. Now, all of this journey right here, going up to Kadesh Barnea, all of that is true, and you'll see that similar on all your maps. The wandering that they did in this area, well, again, that's another one of the things that's a little bit confusing. But it doesn't appear that they took off to the northeast like this. It's hard to see on, you can see it well enough up here. This little lake right here, you'll see in the back of your Bible on a map. It's called the Bitter Lakes. It's really several lakes here. What they appear to do once they left Succoth is they came down to the northwestern shore of the Bitter Lakes. Now, I don't think your Bible will show this. The northwestern shore of the Bitter Lakes, then they began to travel southwesterly just for a little space, and they headed, it's hard to show on such a small map, but they came down, this was the direction they were headed. It looked like they were going right back into Egypt. And this again was a trial of their faith because, well, I'm getting ahead of myself, but what we'll see here in chapter 13 is the shortest way for them to go is to go just like this. This is where the trading route was, just to take off right here along the road of the Philistines here. But God, time and time again, is using even the geography of the land to prove their faith, to see if they're going to trust in Him. So whenever they're heading, and it appears like we're going to get over these various bodies of water and at least get over here into the Sinai Peninsula, they have to turn back toward Egypt just a little bit southwesterly. They come down here to the very end of the Bitter Lakes, and then this is where they're going to cross over right here. Then they're going to head on down. So all of this wandering up here really should be excluded, which is the same as what you've probably got in the back of your Bible. If you look back there and just draw a line from Succoth down to the northwest shore of the Bitter Lakes, and then it would take off a little bit to the southwest, and then it's going to cut back due east and go across the southern end of the Bitter Lakes there. If you don't understand that, I'll show you afterwards if you come up here. And it came to pass, when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God led them not through the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. You see, here's their great trial of 430 years is over, and they think, well, it's bound to be over, and every time they think it's over, here comes another trial for them. They'd been there 430 years. You'd think it's time to go. Now, let's don't play around anymore. And instead of taking them this little short, easy way to get up there, and God had a good reason, He said as soon as they go, they're going to see war, and they're going to want to go back to Egypt again. So He knew that He shouldn't really take them that way in the first place, and He's going to go ahead and take them this long way to fulfill what He had told Moses back in chapter 3 around verse 14, a pledge that He gave to Moses, a token of His faithfulness, that you'll come again and serve me on this mount. And that was the Mount Sinai, down here in the very bottom of the Sinai Peninsula. For God said, lest peradventure the people repent when they see war and they return to Egypt. But God led the people about through the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea, and the children of Israel went up harnessed out of the land of Egypt, that is by rank and file. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, which he had commanded in the end of Genesis 50, for he had straitly sworn the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, ye shall carry up my bones away hence with you. And they took their journey from Succoth and encamped in Etham in the edge of the wilderness. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, to go by day and night. And He took not away the pillar of the cloud by day, nor the pillar of fire by night from before the people. Now, of course, chapter 14, which we want to read several verses here, is their great, what we could call the Exodus, because this is where they're actually leaving the land of Egypt. Although they've left Ramesses and Succoth before, this is where they're going to actually escape the boundaries of the Egyptians. The Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, that they turn, and see, some of these cities here are really hard to point out exactly where they might be. That they turn and encamp before Pihahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, over against Baal Zephon. Before it ye shall encamp by the sea. For Pharaoh shall say of the children of Israel, they are entangled in the land, the wilderness hath shut them in. You see, God, what he's wanting to do is to draw Pharaoh into a trap, and he's going to murder all of them. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he shall follow after them. And I will be honored upon Pharaoh and upon all his host, that the Egyptians may know that I am the Lord. And they did so. And it was told the king of Egypt that the people fled, and the heart of Pharaoh and of his servants was turned against the people. And they said, why have we done this, that we have let Israel go from serving us? Because you've got to realize this is going to wreck their entire economy, their whole country. Letting this many people go who's working for them for 430 years, going to wreck their economy. And of course, we studied briefly about the plagues, and the plagues were very devastating, and they had long-reaching results. Whenever that locust plague came upon the people, of course, that destroyed all of the greenery around, which means you'd have a famine for years and years to come. So it wasn't that God just went through there and did something and it was over the next day. Once they destroyed all that greenery, you're going to have a famine for a long time to come. And now you don't have any slaves. You don't have anyone to work for you anymore. It's going to utterly destroy your economy and everything you've worked for centuries. And God's wanting to show what he can do to the ungodly. He made ready his chariot and took his people with him. And he took 600 chosen chariots and all the chariots of Egypt and captains over every one of them. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And he pursued after the children of Israel, and the children of Israel went out with a high hand. But the Egyptians pursued after them all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh and his horsemen and his army, and overtook them, encamping by the sea, beside Pi-hahiroth, before Baal-zephon. And when Pharaoh drew nigh, the children of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them. And they were sore afraid, and the children of Israel cried out unto the Lord. They said unto Moses, because there were no graves in Egypt, hast thou taken us away to die in the wilderness? Wherefore hast thou dealt thus with us, to carry us forth out of Egypt? Is not this the word that we did tell thee in Egypt, saying, let us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians? For it had been better for us to serve the Egyptians than that we should die in the wilderness. Moses said unto the people, fear ye not. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will show you today. For the Egyptians whom ye have seen today, ye shall see them again no more forever. The Lord shall fight for you, and ye shall hold your peace. And the Lord said unto Moses, wherefore criest thou unto me? Speak unto the children of Israel, that they go forward. But lift up thy rod, and stretch out thine hand over the sea, and divide it. And the children of Israel shall go on dry ground through the midst of the sea. And I, behold, I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, and they shall follow them. And I will get me honor upon Pharaoh, and upon all his host, and upon his chariots, and upon his horsemen. And the Egyptians shall know, what was left of them, that I am the Lord, when I have gotten me honor upon Pharaoh, upon his chariots, and upon his horsemen. Now they're camped beside the Red Sea. It's in the evening time, just before the setting of the sun. They're probably merry up until the time that they look over their shoulder, and they can hear, of course, 600 thundering chariots coming after them. And although you've only got, that might look like a small number, 600 chariots, those were just the chosen ones, and it said there were more chariots beyond that, because you've got 600,000 fighting men here, but what are they going to fight with? And they've been slaves. They're not trained militarily like these Egyptians are. These 600 chariots could wipe out all 600,000 of these men here, these Israelites, because they're not trained. They're not ready. They're not prepared. They're not equipped to do battle with them. So it's just toward the end of the day. The angel of God, which went before the camp of Israel, that is, in the cloud, removed and went behind them. And the pillar of the cloud went from before their face and stood behind them. And it came between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel. And it was a cloud and darkness to them, that is, to the Egyptians, and it gave light by night to these, the Israelites, so that the one came not near the other all the night. That's how we know it's just about the setting of the sun here. And before they can actually overtake them, the cloud goes around, darkens the Egyptians, but gives light to Israel. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. And the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea upon the dry ground, and the waters were a wall unto them on the right hand and on their left. I mean, this is about the greatest miracle that we see in all of the Bible here, is the parting of this great sea, all for their deliverance from their oppressors that have oppressed them for so long. This, by the way, wind which God sends, again, if we go back to our map, it's a supernatural wind, because it's a wind that's going to, of course, come from the east. It's going to split the water right down the middle. Now, you'd think if a wind comes from the east, well, it's going to blow the whole lake over towards the west. And especially if this supernatural wind, let's just say it was a natural wind that was very strong, that had the capability of opening up the sea. Once it opened up the sea, then how could Israel ever pass through? The wind would blow them right back to the other side. So you see, it's something more than just a wind. It's something supernatural, because it's able to slice it rather than roll the whole sea back westwardly. It's able to slice it down the middle, but yet not block Israel whenever they're trying to walk through the middle of the sea. And of course, we know that it piles up way over their head on both sides, a huge heap. They walk through the middle. And by the way, they're doing this during the night. Now, this all takes place during the night. And the Egyptians also began following them. And all of this takes place during the night, because it's the next morning whenever the angel of the Lord looks through that cloud and begins to smite the Egyptians. So it's taken several hours for the wind to open up the sea and, of course, to dry out the land underneath it. The critics raise a problem. Remember now, you've got maybe 3 million people here. And let's say that just all of us lined up in a single line, and we had to pass a certain point that was maybe several miles long, how long it would take us to walk past that. But the only thing that we can determine from the account here, from what we've seen over in chapter 13 when it says they all went up harnessed, is that they are not in single file. They may be 50 people across, so that way they can cover more territory in a quicker amount of time. Because when you've got 3 million people that have to walk just, let's say, 1 mile, that's going to take a long time unless you get them spread out. So that means it wasn't a little narrow passageway that they all walked through. It was a huge thing, because they all had to stand right beside each other and walk through that. So verse 23, just to explain a little bit to you on what that was all about. Too bad we weren't there. Then we could explain it a little more. Or we wouldn't need to, I don't guess, if we were all there. That's a mighty miracle. This chapter 14 is really something. The Egyptians pursued and went in after them to the midst of the sea. Now this is during the end of the night, just before day dawns the next morning. Even all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. And it came to pass that in the morning watch the Lord looked unto the host of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and of the cloud, and troubled the host of the Egyptians. You see, it was following Israel as they would go through. The Lord was in that cloud, and he turned around behind him and saw the Egyptians follow them. And so it says, the Lord took off their chariot wheels, so they drave them heavily, so that the Egyptians said, let us flee from the face of Israel, for Yahweh fighteth for them against the Egyptians. And the Lord said unto Moses, now they're on the other side, stretch out thine hand over the sea, that the waters may come again upon the Egyptians, and upon their chariots, and upon their horsemen. And Moses stretched forth his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to his strength when the morning appeared. And the Egyptians fled against it, and the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. And the waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen and all the host of Pharaoh that came into the sea after them. There remained not so much as one of them. But the children of Israel walked upon dry land in the midst of the sea, and the waters were a wall unto them on the right hand and on their left. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead upon the seashore. And Israel saw that great work which the Lord did upon the Egyptians, and the people feared the Lord and believed the Lord and his servant Moses. So this is what God's always reminding them back to over 70 times. Remember in the Old Testament, I am the Lord thy God that brought thee forth out of the land of Egypt, because he did it in a very great way. Now, from the Septuagint version of the Bible over into the English version of the Bible, we've gotten this word Red Sea. And there's no such thing. The Hebrew calls it the Sea of Reeds, and that's exactly what it is. Just because some people have tried to make the whole thing look ridiculous, since the real name of it is the Sea of Reeds, by saying there was no miracle at all. If it was the old reedy sea, they probably just walked over in the water. Just because some critics have tried to do that doesn't mean that we can invent a new name and call it the Red Sea and try to get away from the idea that it might have been some shallow body of water. But just because it's called the Reed Sea doesn't mean there are reeds out in the very middle of it. There are reeds all around the bank on all sides of it. Besides that, in verse 29 it says that the waters were a wall on both sides of them, which would mean a very high wall. I didn't write down what the Hebrew name is, but throughout your Old Testament, whenever it says Red Sea, as a matter of fact, there are some places that call it the Sea of Reeds. Does anyone know where one of those verses might be? I know there's one over in the Psalms. I could just show you if I could find one of them. Even there, though it may be in the margin, I don't know. Everyone pick a different chapter and look and find it. Don't all look in the same one. We'll never find it then. Hallelujah.
For the continue.
Pick a different chapter and look and find it. Don't all look in the same one. We'll never find it then. Hallelujah. Well, there's one place that calls it the Red Sea. Doesn't even have it in the margin, though. Oh, well, if you find it, you can interrupt me later on and show it to me then. Thank you, brother. But anyway, throughout the Old Testament, it's called the Sea of Reeds, or the Reed Sea. Now, we're going to continue to call it the Red Sea because that's what everyone knows it as. But remember, it's not the Red Sea. It's the Sea of Reeds. I'll show you where the Red Sea is. The Red Sea, of course, is a huge body of water. This body of water right down here at the very bottom. All of this is the Red Sea. Now, they couldn't have walked across that in the night if they had go-karts to ride, because that's miles and miles to get across there. So don't be ridiculous in trying to make it more of a miracle than it is. It's already a great enough miracle as far as I'm concerned. But, I mean, this may be several hundred miles they'd have to walk in one night to get across what's known as the Red Sea. And this is still known as the Red Sea today. But the Sea of Reeds is up here. It's one of these bitter lakes, known as the Bitter Lakes today anyway. One of these little lakes up here. And this is where they're going to cross over. And as soon as they cross over, then they take off heading really south, southeasterly, and they're going to go down to Mount Sinai. Okay, chapter 15 is very famous because it contains the Song of Moses. The Song of Moses takes up verses 1 to 19. Singing praise to God for the great deliverance that he gives his people. Then in verses 20 and 21, Miriam echoes the song. She is called a prophetess here in Exodus 15 and verse 20. The sister, of course, of Moses and Aaron, descendant of Amram and Jochebed of the tribe of Levi. She, along with all the women, get their timbrels and begin to dance. And this isn't on the shore of the Red Sea, as I think our song says, because they would have been drowned in the midst also. This is after they got over on the other side. I tell you what, some of those songs you got to watch out for. Some of the ones we sing around here, we have to explain them because they're not always right in everything they say. People get inspired and get religiously emotional and start writing a song and don't know the whole Bible disagrees with everything they said in their song. Most of those are the denominational ones that said, I'm holding the fort down, or on Jordan's banks I cast where he looked for the other side or something. You don't ever find them doing that in the Bible. They just command the water to depart over in Joshua chapter 3 and 4. And, of course, they walk over for the second time there. Then in verses 22 through 27, here again they've got another trial already. They've run out of water. And this is where we get the healing statute of Exodus 15:26. They're complaining again to the Lord and to Moses. In chapter 16, we have manna and quail sent for the first time. The manna that is sent to the people, you need to understand this difference here in Exodus 16. The manna that is sent to the people in chapter 16 remains permanent for the next 40 years. When we get over to Joshua chapter 5, Joshua 5 is where the manna ends. And he tells us there in Joshua 5 that they had the manna for 40 years. As a matter of fact, we're told in verse 35 of this chapter that they did eat manna 40 years until they came into the land inhabited. But the quail that are sent in chapter 16 are only temporary because they're going to be sent later on at another time. They're not coming every day like the manna is coming. They're only sent for a temporary time period, at least in chapter 16. Of course, we see them complaining, moaning, and groaning again, which we see many times. I've got some scriptures jotted down here to give you on where we see their complainings. Be a good thing to study all those texts out on where we see them complaining so we don't fall into that same trap. I've got 15 places where I've seen them complaining. That's a lot just in these books, 15 times. First of all, Exodus 5 and verse 21. Then Exodus 14, 10 to 12. Then the one we just looked at, Exodus 15, 23 to 24. Exodus 16, 2 to 3. 17 and verse 2. 20 verses 18 to 19. 32 and verse 1. Then the book of Numbers, 11 and verse 1. 11 verses 4 to 6. 14 verses 1 to 4. 16 verse 3. 16 verses 13 to 14. 16 verse 41. 20 verses 2 to 5 and 21 verse 5. "15 occasions where they are complaining. In chapter 17, it's divided in half. We have two important events in chapter 17. The first half of the chapter, we have Moses speaking to the rock and commanding water to come out of the rock for them. It'll be later in the book of Numbers when, of course, he strikes the rock. And in the second half of chapter 17, we have their first battle that they have to engage in, and it's against the children of Amalek, or the Amalekites. This is the first battle they are in, but it's a supernatural battle because as long as Moses keeps his hands upheld, then they're winning the war. And whenever his hands come down, then of course they're losing the war. And along with the introduction of their first war against the Amalekites, we have the introduction of Joshua for the first time, and Hur, H-U-R. Hur and Joshua appear on the scene for the first time here. We'll see both of these men later on in the book of Exodus, and of course we see Joshua all the way over in his book of Joshua. This is the same Joshua now that the book of Joshua speaks of. It's not the same Joshua over in Ezra. It's not the same Joshua in Nehemiah. It's not the same Joshua in Zechariah. That Joshua over in those books, or there are several Joshuas there, those are different Joshuas. But this is the Joshua after whom the book is named. Chapter 18, Moses meets his father-in-law again. We taught a message from this one time in some series before. Maybe that was in the gifts of the Spirit, I don't remember. It was in the gifts, wherever that was. Let's see, in verses 1 and 2, of course, he also meets his wife and his two sons again. Remember back in chapter 4, they had initially gone with him, but then he sent them back sometime between chapter 4 and what we have here in chapter 18. They weren't there during the plagues and during the Exodus, his wife and his two children. So he's been down there without his wife and two children the whole time, because we see in verse 2 it tells us that he had sent them back once they came down there to begin with. So remember, this was Jethro giving the admonition to Moses that he and the people are going to wear away if he tries to judge all of the cases himself. But he gives them some good admonition, some good instruction to appoint some people under him that'll hear cases not as difficult as the ones that would eventually be brought on to Moses. Then in chapter 19, we're entering upon another stage here, because here they've finally gone down, they've passed through several different cities along here, and they're coming down here to Mount Sinai. As a matter of fact, this gets a little technical, but chapter 18 actually takes place after they're already down here, because it says in verse 5 they were encamped by the Mount of God. Now in chapter 19 and verse 1, it appears that they are arriving there for the first time. But again, we've got something that is backwards as far as we would set something up chronologically, because chapter 19 verse 1 talks about them whenever they came on that initial day to the wilderness of Sinai and Mount Horeb there in this wilderness of Sinai. But we know actually they're already there back in chapter 18. It's just that he's needed to include this admonition from Jethro before getting into the material that will start chapter 19, because it starts with the giving of the law to the people, and that will of course continue throughout the rest of the book of Exodus. Here they are down here at Jebel Musa is the name of the mountain even to this day. Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb, 7,600 feet high. Barren wilderness and a barren place down there. It doesn't appear like the place where you would meet God, but this is exactly what happens. Remember, the first verse of chapter 19 is where we get the word Exodus, where we get our name for the book, because it uses it there, talks about when the same day they exited the land of Egypt. So this is where we get the title for our book. Yes, brother. Jebel Musa, Jebel Musa. Well, that's a transliteration over into English, yeah. Jebel Musa. Now, one broad thing I want to tell you here that will immensely help you in studying the rest of the Pentateuch before we get into chapter 19. We're going to forget about chapter 18 and seeing they actually arrive at the mount there. In chapter 19 and verse 1, now it's been 3 months since they've come out of Egypt, since they've crossed over the Red Sea and come out. It's been 3 months since then. In chapter 19 of Exodus and verse 1, they arrive at Mount Sinai. Now they stay there throughout the rest of the book of Exodus, all of the book of Leviticus, and the first third of the book of Numbers. So all that is transpiring while they're camped right here at this mount. They're not wandering around anywhere like they do in the end of the book of Numbers. They are staying right at Mount Sinai in the same camp there at the very same place. They stay there a whole year. And so we know that the rest of the book of Exodus, all of Leviticus, and the first third of the book of Numbers takes place within 1 year time period. And all of this is at Mount Sinai. And I can show you this from Numbers 10 and verse 11. Now, you see, this is right in the middle of a chapter over here, and I'll probably mention it again when we get to Numbers to remind you of this, because it's hard to see. It's right in the middle of the chapter. And you get reading through Leviticus, and you don't know, well, now, were they in Egypt when God gave them those laws? Were they just about into the promised land? Where were they when all of this took place? But in Numbers 10 and verse 11, and it came to pass on the 20th day of the second month in the second year that the cloud was taken up from off the tabernacle of the testimony. And the children of Israel took their journeys out of the wilderness of Sinai, and the cloud rested in the wilderness of Paran, which they have right up here. This is where they're going to end up, somewhere in Paran. So that was the third month of the first year in Exodus 19 and verse 1. Now we're in the second month of the second year, so really you've got about 11 months. We could round it off and say it's been a year now since they've been out of Egypt. And all of this is transpiring during that one time, during a year. So that'll give you some broad overview of the rest of Exodus, and then Leviticus, and then the first third of the book of Numbers, because they'll camp there at the same place. Okay, back to chapter 19 then. This is a very important chapter. This fulfills what God had told Moses earlier in chapter 3, verse 12. I think I said 14 earlier. It's verse 12. Exodus 3 and verse 12. Certainly I will be with thee, and this shall be a token unto thee that I have sent thee. When thou hast brought forth the people out of Egypt, ye shall serve God upon this mountain. The mountain where the burning bush was in Exodus 3 now is the same mountain that we are arriving at in Exodus 19. It's known as Sinai. It's also known as Horeb, H-O-R-E-B. Both of the names, and it's the same mountain, Sinai or Horeb. Now in this chapter, Moses makes 4 trips up Mount Sinai. That's another popular misconception, that he went up to the top of the mountain, got the commandments, and came back down. But he went up 4 times just in this chapter, and in all he went up at least 10 times up to the top of this mountain. Now remember, he's 80 years old. This is a 7,000-foot climb up there. So it's interesting to see that he goes up at least 10 times. Yes, I've got the verses down for this, so I'll give you the verses where we see him going up. 19:3, 9, 10, and 20. 20 in verse 1 and verse 21. 24 verse 9, then verse 15. 32 verse 31, 34, and verse 4. Which ought to amount to around 10 times that he's climbing this 7,000-foot mountain here. And we're going to go and read a few of these verses again in chapter 19. In the 3rd month, when the children of Israel were gone forth out of the land of Egypt, the same day came they into the wilderness of Sinai. For they were departed from Rephidim, and were come to the desert of Sinai, and had pitched in the wilderness, and there Israel encamped before the mount. This is Mount Sinai. And Moses went up unto God, and the Lord called unto him out of the mountain, saying, Thus shalt thou say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel, Ye have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bare you on eagle's wings, and brought you unto myself. Now therefore, if ye will obey my voice indeed, and keep my covenant, then ye shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people, for all the earth is mine. In other words, he's saying, all the earth is mine. I could have chosen anyone I wanted to, but I chose you. And ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and an holy nation. These are the words which thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel. Now we can tell, look at verse 7, Moses already had to have come back down the mount here. He's got to tell that, now he's got to go back up again. Moses came and called the elders of the people, and laid before their faces all the words which the Lord commanded him. And all the people answered together and said, All that the Lord has spoken we will do. What a pious confession they made. And Moses, they didn't do anything that he told them to do. But we see God's long-suffering and his patience with them. I gave you those 15 times where they're always murmuring and complaining against him. But he's long-suffering until his wrath has no remedy, which is what 2 Chronicles 36 says. It finally came to the time there was no remedy for his wrath, and he had to destroy him after that. Moses returned the words of the people unto the Lord. So we can tell he's gone back up if he had to return these words to the Lord. The Lord said unto Moses, Lo, I come unto thee in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with thee, and believe thee forever. Now he comes back down, and Moses told the words of the people to the Lord. Now he's gone back up in verse 10. The Lord said unto Moses, Go unto the people, sanctify them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their clothes. And be ready against the 3rd day. For the 3rd day the Lord will come down in the sight of all the people upon Mount Sinai. And thou shalt set bounds unto the people round about, saying, Take heed to yourselves, that ye go not up into the mount, or touch the border of it. Whosoever toucheth the mount shall be surely put to death. There shall not an hand touch it, but he shall surely be stoned or shot through. Hebrews 12 says, with a dart. Whether it be a beast or man, it shall not live. And when the trumpet soundeth long, they shall come up to the mount. Moses went down from the mount unto the people, and sanctified the people. And they washed their clothes, and he said unto the people, Be ready against the 3rd day, and come not at your wives. And it came to pass on the 3rd day, in the morning, that there were thunders and lightnings, and a thick cloud upon the mount, and the voice of the trumpet exceeding loud, so that all the people that was in the camp trembled. And Moses brought forth the people out of the camp to meet with God. You see, Moses is their great mediator, an intercessor here. And they stood at the nether part of the mount, And Mount Sinai was altogether on a smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire. And the smoke thereof ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mount quaked greatly. And when the voice of the trumpet sounded long and waxed louder and louder, Moses spake, and God answered him by a voice. The Lord came down upon Mount Sinai, on the top of the mount, and the Lord called Moses up to the top of the mount, and Moses went up. So here I think must be the fourth time that we see him going up. And the Lord said unto Moses, Go down, charge the people, lest they break through unto the Lord to gaze, and many of them perish. Now God's already told him to set a bounds around there, and he's telling Moses, go down there and tell them again. And Moses, of course, says, I've already told them for the first time. He said, go tell them again, because I know Israel, that some of them are going to want to pass through and see what's going on. Let the priests also, which come near to the Lord, sanctify themselves, lest the Lord break forth upon them. And Moses said unto the Lord, The people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for thou charged us, saying, Set bounds about the mount and sanctify it. The Lord said unto him, Away, get thee down, and thou shalt come up, thou and Aaron with thee, but let not the priests and the people break through to come up unto the Lord, lest he break forth upon them. So Moses went down unto the people and spake unto them. So that's 4 times he's gone up to the mount here in this chapter. What's interesting in verse 22 and verse 24 is the mentioning of the priest. There's no priesthood yet. That's what he's fixing to give them laws about. Ever thought of that before? No Levites yet. They're not chosen until later on in the book. But we can't comment on that, can we? Priests already in verse 22 and verse 24. Now chapter 20 through chapter 23 are the first series of laws that God gives to them. He gives the 10 Commandments to everyone. Now he doesn't write them at this time. He doesn't write them until much later. He speaks them for the first time. The second time he writes them. The third time he has to write them again, of course. But for the first 17 verses, God is speaking the 10 Commandments. This is to everyone. Then from the 22nd verse of Exodus 20, all the way through 21, 22, and 23, we have various laws given to Moses while he's up on the mount. So the end of 20, then all of 21, 22, and 23, just various laws, ordinances, statutes, commandments, and so forth that God is giving to Moses now while he's all up on the mount. He's gone up there, of course, for that would be the 6th time by then. Chapter 24, we have what is known as the ratification of the law. Other things happen later on in the chapter, but in chapter 24, we have the ratification of the law. Even though God hadn't given all of what he's going to say, he's given the heart of it, and of course that's the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments. The last verse in chapter 24, we see Moses going back up to the mount, and here's where he stays for 40 days and 40 nights. And his staying up here 40 days and 40 nights he has to do twice, because the tables are renewed for a second time. Over in chapter 34, I believe. Okay, then we have chapters 25 to 31. Make up a section of ceremonial laws. Chapters 25 to 31. And it basically concerns the tabernacle and all the furniture that is to go into the tabernacle. And of course it also concerns Aaron and his sons being set apart as priests unto the Lord. Those are some of the things you find in these chapters. God is giving him commandments on how the tabernacle is to be built. Now don't confuse the priests and the Levites, because of course the priests and the Levites were 2 different groups of people, and they had 2 different functions entirely. So this is only speaking of the priests now. Aaron and the rest of the priests, which we see over in chapter 28. In chapter 31, we're still in this one section. Chapter 31, we have 2 men. This is the only place we see them. Their importance is demonstrated here in chapter 31, verse 2 and verse 6. Bezaleel and Aholiab. These are the 2 men that are chosen to do all of this work. concerning the tabernacle and the various things that are to go in it, because they're skilled, and God said, I put my Spirit, wisdom and knowledge and understanding and all manner of workmanship upon them so they can accomplish these things. So those are the two men, Bezaleel and Aholiab. Now, finally, the last verse of the chapter, God is finally writing the Ten Commandments. Now, they're really, again, in Hebrew, they're not called the Ten Commandments, they're called the 10 words. Because each whole commandment, as far as God was concerned, was one word to the people. So we could call them the 10 words. Sometimes I think it has it called that in your Bible, the 10 words. But just because God spoke them over in chapter 20 doesn't mean that's where he's writing them. He's not writing them here until the very end of chapter 31. Now, what do you think all of chapter 32 is about? It's when Moses comes back down off the mount, and of course they made the golden calf. So that's a familiar story we can pass over. All of chapter 32 then is Aaron and the people making the golden calf. Now it's in chapter 32 where we see the significance of the Levites demonstrated for the first time, because when Moses calls for all those who are on the Lord's side to step over with him, then it's the tribe of Levi that steps over in chapter 32. In chapter 33, God promises Moses he's not going to go with them into the promised land. He's just going to send an angel. Moses argues with him vehemently over that and says, no, we won't go then if you won't go with us. He's not pouting or anything. It's a bold faith that he's coming before God. No, I won't get by. I won't let you do anything for me except your best. I want you to go with us. Then in chapter 34 is when Moses sees God's glory. Another tremendous occurrence. God passes before him and says, Yahweh, Yahweh, merciful, gracious, long-suffering, abundant in goodness and truth. And it's also at this time that he renews the tables with Moses. Moses, of course, broke the first two tables. It's in verse 28. You have to go over into your margin, but there you get the 10 words. If you look over in your margin in verse 28 of chapter 34, the end of the verse, over in your margin it says, rather than the 10 commandments, the 10 words. Then the final division of the book is chapters 35 through 40. And that is the people building the tabernacle. God gave them all those instructions in the first place, from chapter 25 to chapter 31. Pertain to the building of the tabernacle. So then in chapters 35 through 40, we have them obeying the Lord. Show you several pictures of it. This is another set of transparencies that I have. Can you see that up at the top? Some people don't even know what the whole thing looked like. It's small and you can't see everything there, but you can see the outer court here. That was, some people were allowed to come into, and then you'd go on to the inner court. Here you've got your altar, burnt offering, then your laver. This is the tabernacle. It appears to have a flat roof on it rather than a gabled roof, because there's never a mentioning anywhere in there of that board that would have to go, or pole that would have to go across the very top if you've got a slanted roof. A lot of times you'll see it in pictures with a slanted roof, which I think is Dr. Schick's interpretation of what these passages mean. Appears to have a flat roof there. Let's see, I had another transparency to show you what was actually inside the tabernacle. And you need to be familiar with both of these. Of course, the opening was to the east, very significant over in Ezekiel, the opening to the east. Then we have the altar of burnt offering, the laver. This is the tabernacle proper here. You'd come in from the east. On the south side, you have the golden lampstand. On the north, you have the table of shewbread, and on the west, you have the altar of incense. Then this is known as the holy place. This little section in here is known as the Holy of Holies. This is the Ark of the Covenant. These are the two cherubim on both sides. And I'll just give you a warning about the tabernacle. Whenever we'll study the tabernacle sometimes, there are a lot of types and typology used in the tabernacle, but You just got to beware. You can't go beyond the bounds of, especially the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews tells us a lot of what these types were. But some people, just like Jesus' parables, they're trying to explain everything that was there that God never intended to be explained. It's just there. It didn't typify anything. It was just there. So be careful when people try to tell you what everything meant in the tabernacle. Same way with Jesus' parables, telling you what every twig and every branch means in his parables. Then the last verses 34 through 38, the last chapter, we see they've raised up the tabernacle. The cloud is no longer just following along with them. The cloud rests upon the tabernacle. And that's where it stays the rest of the time with them. It goes up and down on the tabernacle. When it's time to go, the cloud lifts up. When it's time to stop, the cloud comes down. And it rests right here upon the tabernacle. Any questions about any of that? We'll take more time, like I said, to study this tabernacle later on. I can explain some more things to you. Whenever you read those chapters of Exodus and it talks all about the badger skins dyed red, there's no such thing as a badger in Palestine or Sinai in the first place, and all these different animals that you see, the various skins that they use to make this structure here, it's confusing to you. But if you really take your time to read it, you can see how there were covers. It was laid over the whole top. You would lay them over the whole top, and they would droop down on both sides, and some would be shorter than the others, so you could see the bottom of one curtain and the bottom of the next one, and then you'd have one that would go over your whole head, and then it would cover the whole thing. And then I think you ought to be familiar with these other things, your burnt offering and laver and stuff like that. No questions on any of that? Whenever he first came to Pharaoh, that's back in chapter 7, when it said that he's 80 years old. So we know he sees Pharaoh for the first time in chapter 5. And, of course, at that time, he would be 80 years old. Now, remember, the plagues take around a year. So it's not until Moses is 81 whenever they're actually leaving. And so that would still be the year 1447, though. That would be chapter 11, chapter 12, all those chapters along there would be in 1447, all the way up until when they're at Sinai, because that's only the third month after they'd come out. So that would still be in the same year, 1447.
For a complete